Sir, please, my legs. Her voice was barely there. A whisper fighting through wind. I can't get up. He almost didn't hear it. The bus shelter on Elgin Street was lit by a single flickering panel, half covered in ice. It was the kind of February night Ottawa doesn't warn you about. Not on the forecast, not in conversation. The kind that arrives sideways, slipping under your coat collar, settling into your joints like it belongs there. 11:30 on a Tuesday. Not a soul on the street. Just snow driving horizontal and a 63-year-old Haitian-Canadian man named Edouard Beaumont standing at the corner, late from a 12-hour shift, about to keep walking. He stopped. She was on the bench inside the shelter. Small. Coat far too thin for -31 with the wind chill. White hair plastered flat against her forehead. One hand gripping the side panel of the shelter, the other pressed to her chest. Her lips had gone gray. Ma'am? Nothing at first. Then her eyes opened, dark, sharp, the eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime being underestimated. Please, she managed. I fell, my hip. Edouard looked up the street. Empty. Both directions. He looked at his phone, full bars. He dialed 911. Busy signal, 3 times. The storm had overloaded the lines somewhere. He could hear the dispatcher for a fraction of a second, then static. He put his phone away, looked at the woman again. She was shaking so hard, her teeth were clicking together like a metronome. He had $14 and a transit card in his wallet. His apartment was 3 stops north. He had a doctor's appointment for his knee at 7 in the morning. The knee that had kept him off roofing work for 3 months. The knee that had cost him the only trade he'd ever been any good at. He had a daughter, Nadia, who called on Sundays and worried too much, and didn't know he was eating crackers for dinner 3 nights a week. He had a chest cold he hadn't mentioned to anyone. He reached down and put his arms under hers and lifted. She made a sound. Not a cry, something more controlled than that. A woman used to not letting people see her pain. He got her to her feet. She couldn't put weight on her right side. He took it. I'm going to get you somewhere warm, he said. Do you understand? She nodded once, tight, economical. Like nodding was a resource she wasn't willing to waste. His name was Edouard Beaumont. He was 63 years old. He had come to Canada at 22 with a suitcase, and the address of a cousin in Gatineau written on a piece of paper he kept in his sock for safekeeping. He had worked roofing for 31 years. He knew which shingles failed in ice, which flashing rusted before it should, which contractors padded the labor hours, and which ones didn't. He had a reputation in the glebe and in Vanier, a man you could trust to show up and do it right. He had a bad knee and a pride that wouldn't let him ask for help, and a daughter who was 31 and lived in Halifax and called on Sundays. His wife, Lucy, had died 4 years ago. Ovarian cancer. 18 months from diagnosis to the last morning. They had been married 34 years. He still slept on his side of the bed. After Lucy, he went back to work too fast. The knee gave out 8 months ago on a pitch roof in Nepean. He'd been on partial disability and handyman work since. Leaky faucets, caulking, drywall patches. The kind of work that pays cash and doesn't ask too many questions and doesn't cover the rent if February runs long. February always runs long. The nearest open door was a Tim Hortons on Sparks. Half a block. It felt like a kilometer. Edouard had the woman's arm across his shoulders, one hand around her waist, and he was walking on a knee that had been telling him to stop for the last 4 hours. The wind came off the rideau and pushed against them like something deliberate. They made it through the door. The overnight staff, a young man named Theodore, barely 20, earbuds around his neck, came around the counter fast. She needs heat, Edouard said. Chair closest to the back, away from the door. Theodore didn't ask questions. He got a chair. He got a cup of hot water, not coffee, just water, hot from the urn, which was exactly the right instinct. Edouard sat across from her and looked at her properly for the first time. She was in her mid-70s, he guessed. Practical clothes, not cheap, but understated. A silk scarf inside the coat collar, ice-stiffened now. Small pearl earrings. She had the posture of someone who had spent decades at the head of tables. What is your name, ma'am? She looked at him the way someone looks at a door they're deciding whether to open. Irene, she said. Irene Thibault. Edouard. He nodded. Edouard Beaumont. How long were you outside? Her jaw tightened. She didn't know. The taxi had dropped her at the wrong address. Her phone had died. She'd been trying to get to her nephew's apartment on Lisgar. She'd walked 2 blocks before her hip. An old replacement, the left side, 5 years ago, locked up on the ice. She'd been in that shelter for she didn't know how long. 40 minutes, maybe longer. Edouard had Theodore call an ambulance while he sat with her. The dispatcher answered this time. 12-minute wait due to call volume. He ordered a tea for her. He didn't order anything for himself. He had $14. They sat. The heat from the back of the restaurant was starting to work. Color was returning to her face by degrees. You should not have been out there alone, he said. Not tonight. She looked at him steadily. No, I shouldn't have been. She paused. You were the only one who stopped. He hadn't thought about that until she said it. He looked back through the window at the street, empty. But it hadn't been entirely empty on his way down. He'd passed 2 other people, head down, walking fast. The way you walk in February when you have somewhere to be. He didn't say anything. She said, You're hurt too. She was looking at the way he'd been holding his leg. Old knee injury. You're limping. I'm fine. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him before. Like she was cataloging him. Like she had spent so long reading people that she couldn't turn it off. The ambulance came. 2 paramedics, efficient, kind. They wanted to take Edouard too. He looked hypothermic, one of them said, which startled him because he hadn't thought about himself at all. He declined. Irene was loaded onto the stretcher. She looked back at him from the doorway. Thank you, Edouard, she said, his full name. Like she wanted to remember it exactly. He waved once. Then he sat in that Tim Hortons with a cup of hot water Theodore quietly replaced 3 times without being asked, and he waited until he felt like he could stand without shaking. He took the bus home, sat in the front seat where the heat came up from the floor, got off at his stop at 1:15 midnight, walked up to the 2nd floor of his building. The elevator was out again, and unlocked his apartment. It was a good apartment. Small but his. He had a photograph of Lucy on the bookshelf. He had a poster from a jazz festival in Montreal from 1991 that had never come down. He had tools organized along one wall on hooks he'd installed himself, and a kitchen that was cleaner than you'd expect, and a window that faced east so he got the morning light. He sat on the edge of the bed. His knee was swollen. He'd feel that for a week. Nadia called on Sundays. Today was Tuesday. He didn't call. He hadn't saved anyone, he thought. He'd just given someone a shoulder to lean on and sat in a warm place until help came. That wasn't heroic. That was Tuesday. He set his alarm for 6, made sure the coffee was ready to go, and went to sleep. He didn't know that Irene Thibault, from her hospital bed at the Ottawa General, had already asked the attending nurse for a pen and a piece of paper. He didn't know that she had written down his name twice, once on the paper, once on the back of her own hand, because she was not taking chances with memory at her age. He didn't know that she had called her nephew Bastien at 1 a.m. and told him to find out everything he could about a man named Edouard Beaumont, who had been working roofing in the National Capital Region for 30 years. He didn't know any of that. He slept. Now, before the morning comes, before the knock on the door, before everything changes, let me tell you who Edouard Beaumont was. Not what he did, who he was. He came to Ottawa in 1984, spoke French, spoke Creole, and was learning English from the radio and from the men on the roofing crews who had no patience for slow learners and no patience for anyone who looked like Edouard. He learned fast. He always had. Not because it was easy, because the alternative was to fall behind, and Edouard Beaumont did not fall behind. He married Lucy Arsenault in 1989 at the church on Laurier. She was from Hawkesbury. Her parents had complicated feelings about the wedding that they kept mostly to themselves. Over 20 years, they stopped keeping them to themselves. And over another 10, they came around to something that looked like pride. Edouard had never mentioned any of it to Nadia, who grew up knowing her grandparents as people who showed up with maple candy and stayed too long at Christmas. He and Lucy had wanted more children. It hadn't happened. Nadia was enough. More than enough, everything. But you feel the other children sometimes, the ones who didn't come. Edouard felt them when Lucy got sick, when the house got quiet, when Sunday calls weren't quite enough to fill a week. He had been the kind of roofer other roofers called when they had questions. Not the foreman type, not the paperwork type. The type who could look at a failing roof and tell you in 30 seconds what was wrong and how long you had before it became expensive. He had trained 4 apprentices over the years. 3 of them had their own crews now. One sent a card at Christmas and always signed it from both of them, his name and his wife's, and Edouard kept the cards in a shoebox on the shelf above the tools. After the knee, after the disability, he didn't complain. He took the handyman jobs. He fixed Mrs. Papa Dimitrio's leaking radiator pipe on the 3rd floor, no charge, because she was 80 and alone. He shoveled the walkway outside the building whenever he was the first one up, which was almost always. He attended the community meetings at the church basement on Bank Street about the shelter that needed repairs. And when the meeting ended, he stayed behind and looked at the repairs himself and wrote up a list of what could be done for under $500 and left it with the pastor. He didn't talk about any of this. It wasn't for talking about. The knee appointment the next morning was 7 o'clock at the Riverside Clinic. The doctor told him the cartilage was deteriorating faster than expected. Not surgical yet. But the trajectory was clear. He would need the knee replaced inside 18 months. The cost, even with provincial coverage, the recovery time, the months without work. He drove home in the hospital transit van they provided for patients with mobility issues and sat in his kitchen with a cup of coffee and looked at the east window. He called Nadia. She picked up on the second ring even though it was Wednesday, not Sunday. She could always tell. 31 years had not changed that. Papa, what's wrong? Nothing is wrong. He paused. The knee is a little more complicated than they thought. Silence on her end. She was a speech-language pathologist in Halifax, precise, patient, trained to listen to what wasn't being said. He heard her processing it. How complicated? They will replace it. Not yet. Maybe a year. She asked the right questions. He answered them without minimizing too much, because she would know if he minimized too much. They talked for 40 minutes. By the end, he felt something that was not quite okay, but was something adjacent to okay, which was good enough for a Wednesday. He had been home for 2 hours when the buzzer sounded. He pressed the intercom. Yes? A voice, calm, professional. Mr. Beaumont? My name is Gilles Fontaine. I work for Irene Thibault. She asked me to come by if you have a few minutes. Edouard stood at the intercom for a moment, looked at the door, looked back at his kitchen. He buzzed the man in. Gilles Fontaine was in his 50s. Compact, serious, the kind of man who had been in the background of important rooms for so long that he had learned to be invisible in plain sight. He came up the stairs without being winded. He shook Edouard's hand with a grip that assessed without performing. Mrs. Thibault is being discharged today, Gilles said. She's asked me to bring you to her home if you're willing. She'd like to speak with you in person. Edouard looked at him. Is she all right? Better than she should be, given last night. The doctors are frankly puzzled by how well she's doing. Gilles paused. She tends to have that effect on medical professionals. Edouard almost smiled. He said, She doesn't need to do anything for me. She's not doing anything for you, Gilles said. She wants to have a conversation. There's a difference. Edouard thought about that. He got his coat. The car was a dark gray Volvo. Clean, quiet, nothing that announced itself. They drove along the river, then east, then into the Rockcliffe neighborhood. The old part, the part where the houses were set back from the street, behind hemlock hedges and the driveways were long enough to disappear around corners. Edouard had done roofing work in Rockcliffe exactly 4 times in 30 years. The houses in Rockcliffe did not have problems. They had situations which were handled quietly by people like Gilles. The house was stone and cedar, wide rather than tall, overlooking the river, understated in the way that things are understated when they have no need to prove anything. He didn't know the name until he saw it on the gatepost. Thibault. He knew the name. Every person in the construction and development sector in eastern Ontario knew the name. Thibault Infrastructure had been building roads, bridges, community facilities, and affordable housing across the province since the 1970s. Started by Irene's late husband, Renaud, and expanded tenfold by Irene after his death in 2002. Hospitals in Sudbury, a pedestrian bridge in Kingston, community housing in 3 Ottawa neighbourhoods he could name off the top of his head. He sat in the passenger seat for a moment after Gilles parked. "That Thibault?" he said. Gilles looked at him calmly. "Yes." He went inside. Irene was in the sitting room, which looked out over a garden that was buried under February, but that you could tell, in summer, was serious. She was in a chair with a throw across her lap, a compression bandage on the hip, color fully restored, sharp as a new blade. "Edouard," she said. He sat across from her. A tea was already poured. She looked at him, the same look as last night, the cataloging look, but warmer now. Or maybe he was just seeing it differently. She said, "I asked Gilles to find out who you are." He said, "I'm a roofer who can't currently roof." She said it without cruelty, just directly. He appreciated that. Most people tiptoe around a man's limitations. She didn't. "The knee," he said. "Yes." She nodded. "And before the knee, 31 years. 4 apprentices with their own crews." She paused. "The radiator pipe on the 3rd floor. Mrs. Papadimitriou." She named her exactly. Edouard was quiet. "The church basement on Bank Street," she continued. "The repair list you left with the pastor. He told Gilles about it last night. He's kept the list. Still hasn't found the money for the repairs." Edouard looked at her. "I don't understand why you're telling me this. Because I want you to understand that I didn't send Gilles to find your bank balance. I sent him to find out who you are when no one's looking." She folded her hands in her lap, which is the only version of a person that matters. He had nothing to say to that. It was the truest thing anyone had said to him in a long time. She reached for the tea, didn't drink it immediately, just held it. "I've been working on a project for 2 years, she said. Maybe longer. Since Renaud. Since I watched what happened to the east end of Ottawa, when the development money went to the suburbs and the communities that needed the most investment got the least attention." She paused. "Buildings I can build. Infrastructure I can fund. I have people who do that. What I have not been able to find is someone who can actually sit inside a community and understand what it needs. Not what a consultant's report says it needs. What it actually needs." Edouard watched her. "There are 4 buildings in Vanier that Thibault Infrastructure is prepared to redevelop as affordable housing, combined with community trades training, real training, electrical, plumbing, roofing, carpentry. The kind of training that leads to Red Seal certification and living wages, not volunteer certificates." She looked at him steadily. "I need a director. Someone who knows the trades from the ground up and knows this community. Someone the community will actually trust." He said nothing for a long moment. He said, "I'm 63. She said, "I'm 74, and I'm running a $2 billion company from a chair with a compression bandage on my hip. Age is not the argument you think it is." He almost laughed. He didn't. But it was close. He said, "I don't have a business degree. I don't have management experience. I have a bad knee and a roofing ticket, and 30 years of knowing which end of a nail gun to hold." She said, "The last director I hired had an MBA from McGill and no idea what a vapor barrier was." She paused. "The trades training program failed in 8 months. The community didn't trust him. He didn't speak their language, not French, not the other language. The one you learn by showing up for 30 years and not asking to be recognized for it." He was quiet again. She said, "You don't have to decide today, but I want you to hear the rest of it. So you're making an informed decision." She told him the numbers, the facility budget, the operating budget, the salary, which made him sit very still in his chair, the 5-year commitment, the partnership with the college for Red Seal pathways, the union apprenticeship connections she'd spent 18 months building, and then she said, "The church basement on Bank Street. The repairs are part of the first phase, the center partners with it." He looked at her. The pastor told Jill about the list you left, she said. He also told him that you came back 6 weeks later and looked at the furnace again. On your own time, when it was 22 below. Edouard looked at the window, at the frozen garden, at the river thick with ice, still moving underneath. He said, "My daughter lives in Halifax," she said. "Halifax is 2 hours on a plane." She paused. "And I suspect your daughter would have something to say about her father. Turning down the thing his whole life has been pointing toward." He thought about Nadia. Her voice on the phone this morning, the 40 minutes. The way she stayed on the line, not because she had to, but because she was making sure he was all right. He thought about Lucy, about what she would say if she were in this room. He knew exactly what she would say. She would say, "Edouard, stop being stubborn. Drink your tea." He drank his tea, he said, "I have 2 conditions." Irene raised an eyebrow, just slightly, like she'd been expecting 3. "The church basement repairs are part of the first phase, yes. Not the second. The first." She nodded. "Done. And the apprentices, the people who come through the program, if they have the skill, they get real placements. Not preference, not charity. But the contractors on your projects are obligated to interview them. Seriously." She looked at him. "I'll put it in writing. Then I'm in." They shook hands. Her grip was the same as last night. The grip of a woman who had spent 50 years in rooms full of men who had underestimated her, and who had long ago decided not to waste energy being bothered by that. He went home. He called Nadia. She was quiet for a moment when he finished telling her, and then she said, "Papa." Her voice had that quality it had sometimes, the quality that reminded him of Lucy. He didn't say that out loud. He didn't need to. "I'll book a flight," she said. "I want to see this building before they break ground." He laughed. And this time it was all the way. The ground broke in April. April in Ottawa is a complicated month. Still gray, still cold some days, but with something underneath it, something about to happen. The ceremony was short and practical in the way that Irene preferred. No balloons. The equipment was already there. Edouard spoke for 4 minutes, which was 3.5 minutes longer than he'd originally planned, and still the shortest speech of the morning. Nadia was in the second row, in a yellow coat that stood out in the February gray crowd like something deliberate. Theodore, from the Tim Hortons, the one who'd known to bring hot water without being asked, was in the first cohort of the trades training program. He'd shown up at the information session with a notebook and 3 questions written out in advance, which Edouard took as a good sign. He was fast with his hands and asked the right kind of questions, the ones that led somewhere. The church basement was repaired in the 3rd week. The pastor, whose name was Father Augustin, came and stood in the repaired basement and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "You know what this room is going to be used for next week?" Edouard didn't know. "A community meal," Father Augustin said. "We haven't been able to run it since October because of the water damage. Next week, 60 people come for Sunday dinner. Because of this room." Edouard drove home that night and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and looked at the east window. It was dark, nothing to see. But he sat there anyway. He thought about February, about the bus shelter on Elgin Street, about a woman's voice in the wind. He thought about the 31 years, the bad knee, the mornings he'd eaten toast standing over the sink and gone out anyway. He thought about Lucy. He thought, as he did every evening, that he would tell her about the day. He thought about what she would say. He knew what she would say. She would say, "You see, I told you." He had never been able to figure out exactly what she had been telling him. But somehow, sitting there, it started to feel clear. On the wall of the main hallway of the Beaumont Community Trade Center. They named it that without asking him, and he was too embarrassed to object, which Irene found amusing. There were 2 things in a glass case. The first was the repair list. The one he'd left with Father Augustin 2 years earlier. A piece of yellow legal paper with things crossed out and written over in pencil. Below it, a small card that said, "What you do when no one is watching." The second was a transit pass, October to January expired. The one he'd had in his pocket that night on Elgin Street. Irene had asked for it for the case. He'd found it in his coat pocket, where he always forgot things, and given it to Gilles in an envelope without ceremony. He thought it was a strange thing to put in a glass case. But he didn't say so. And then one night, near the end of the first year, after a late class, welding, 18 students, 4 of them women who had come in skeptical and were leaving with sparks on their sleeves and pride in the set of their shoulders. Edouard walked out to the parking lot and found a young woman sitting on the steps, 20-something, thin jacket, staring at her phone like it might still come to life. The heating in her building had been off for 3 days, she told him. Landlord wasn't answering. She'd come to her cousin's, but her cousin wasn't home. She was trying to figure out what to do next. He went back inside, made her a tea, called the city's 24-hour tenant support line, from the number he'd pinned to the corkboard in his office 3 months ago, the day it came in from the city directory, on the instinct that someone would need it eventually. Within 2 hours she had a temporary accommodation referral, and the landlord had received a bylaw notice. She sat across from him in the training room waiting for the call. She looked around at the welding bays, the tool stations, the certificates on the wall from the first cohort. "What is this place?" she said. He thought about how to answer that. "Somewhere someone stopped," he said. She looked at him. He handed her the tea. Outside the snow was falling. Quiet, steady. Ottawa in winter, which is to say the world pausing before it decides what happens next. I keep thinking about that bus shelter. About the woman's voice in the wind that most people walk past without hearing. About what it costs to stop and what it costs not to. Not the money, though that was real. The bus fare, the $14, the knee that ached for a week afterward. The other cost, the one you pay in a different currency. You can talk yourself out of stopping in about 3 seconds. The timing isn't right. You're already late. It's not your problem. Somebody else will handle it. And all of those things might even be true, technically. But none of them are the real reason. The real reason is that stopping requires you to be present in someone else's difficulty. And that's uncomfortable, and we have gotten very good at not being uncomfortable. Edouard Beaumont did not have more to give than the 30 people who walked past that shelter. He had less. He had $14 and a bad knee and a chest cold and a doctor's appointment in the morning. He had every legitimate reason to keep walking. But he knew something, not as a philosophy, just as a thing that was true, that need doesn't wait for convenient timing, that a person on a bench in the cold is a person on a bench in the cold, regardless of what's in your wallet, or what's waiting for you at home. That you can spend your whole life getting ready to be the kind of person who stops. Or you can just stop. I'm not telling you this story because the ending is beautiful, though it is. I'm telling you this story because the moment that mattered happened at 11:30, on a Tuesday night on a street with no witnesses, when a man with $14 heard a voice in the wind and decided it was worth stopping for. That's it. That's the whole thing. Everything else came after. So, if there's a voice you've been walking past in your building, in your neighborhood, in your own family, somewhere you've been moving too fast to hear, maybe tonight is the night to slow down. Drop a comment and tell me honestly. Would you have stopped? You don't need more than you have to give what matters. Remember that.